Well, hello and welcome. As I start this show, it's been a busy couple of weeks here. I'm getting ready to do my intro and getting ready to say hello, and I'm Guy Stevens. And for a moment, I'm actually thinking who I am and where I am. But again, I am Guy Stevens, the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Want to thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about our guest today. We've got a great interview planned. And let me tell you a little bit more about the Alliance before we talk about that. Those of you that are familiar with us probably know well who we are, but we are the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Started the organization about 3 years ago with the idea of raising awareness about the issue related to the use of restraint and seclusion in schools across the country. Since that time, our mission has continued to evolve. It's not just about restraint and seclusion, it's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all the things that are often happening to children and youth in the name of behavior, in the name of discipline. It's things that are happening to people in schools. It's in the troubled teen industry. It's even in hospital settings and other places where there are things that are causing a lot of harm to people. So our mission is really about connecting people together. We want to connect people together to change kind of hearts and minds and laws and policies to create not only safer schools, but safer settings for many people in many different situations. So today I am very excited to have with us Joe Brummer, and Joe has developed a trauma-informed approach to restorative practices. I'm going to tell you more about Joe in just a moment here, but we're going to be interviewing Joe to learn more about the work that he's been doing with restorative practices and the work he's been doing in general. And I had a really fortunate opportunity to actually meet Joe just a couple days ago, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Some exciting things out there happening. So as always, if you have any questions, so this will be an interview today. It's an interview format. I have a number of questions that I'll be asking, and certainly we'll probably be going in a lot of different directions, but you are welcome at any time to put your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping my eye out for those. And as they pop up, I'll try to go through some of those questions. I do want to let you know, as always, these sessions are always recorded. So this is always going to be available after the fact on Facebook, on YouTube, and as an audio podcast. So you have lots of places to go back and listen or view. So with that, let me go ahead now and introduce to you our very special guest. So I've got with me today Joe Brummer, and to tell you a little bit about Joe, and then we'll get started here. So Joe has actually been the victim of two separate violent anti-gay hate crimes. And that kind of led him down a personal journey of healing to the trauma, and this transformed into a professional path and involvement in the field of community and restorative justice. We often hear about people who have had journeys that have been very difficult, but have been able to take that and turn it into positive change for other people. And certainly that's true of Joe. Joe is the author of a recently published book called Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School. Skills and approaches for improving culture and behavior. And I am looking down because I have my own copy here. I'd hoped when I saw Joe to get a signed copy, and unfortunately I got pulled off to a session and didn't make it back in time. But it's a fantastic book, something I would highly recommend. So with that, let me go ahead and say hello to Joe, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's fun. It's fun to be here.
Absolutely thrilled to have you. And this timing, of course, was not planned, but what it turns out happened is we were both attending the same conference earlier this week, and both presenting there as well, and had the opportunity to meet in person, which was a great honor for me to be able to meet you after having talked to you before and learn more about your work and reading your book. So really excited to do that, and some great things came out of that we can talk about later. But really excited to have you here. As you know, we've been doing work around restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all the things that are often being done to a lot of our children and youth, very often in the name of behavior, and very often leading to significant harm. And I think we're probably on a very similar mission here in terms of better supporting individuals from a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, super happy to be here.
Great. So I'm going to start off with a couple questions, and I'm sure that the few questions I've written down here that I knew I wanted to ask you are going to lead into many more. And I want to encourage our audience. You have the opportunity to put your questions in the chat, so please do that. In the short term, though, before you have questions, if you want to tell us who you are and where you're from, always love to know where people are watching from. Joe, we've developed an audience that is really kind of across the world. It always amazes me. We have people watching from Australia and New Zealand and all sorts of places. So really great to have you join us and kind of share your, what you've learned. So let me begin with a question. So I'm going to say that Joe, you wrote the book, that's what I'm going to call it, on trauma-informed restorative school practices. So, there's a lot out there on trauma-informed approaches. There's a lot out there on restorative practices as well. And of course, I understand that, from your background that you actually were the victim of a couple violent crimes. I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about your journey, because I think that, your journey is inspirational in terms of thinking about how sometimes we are impacted by things in our lives that are transformative and may lead us down roads that we never expected to go. And, while situations can be different, I think that you are doing the work that you are doing now. I'm going to say, because I believe you are meant to do this work and making a huge difference. But can you tell us a little bit more about your journey and kind of how you ended up, where you are and doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange journey. I'm not exactly sure how I got here. Some days I have to pause and be like, wow, why am I doing this again? How did I get here? And it's like I can't imagine myself doing something else. But and the two hate crimes that I've lived through, both of which almost took my life. I mean, no lie, that's instantly transformative for anyone, I would think. I'm also a survivor of trauma, not just that these two. It's going to sound like a really interesting statement, but those two events were probably the least of my traumatic events. Mm-hmm. They're just the ones I'm willing to talk about and be public about. But the reality is, I'm also the survivor of abuse. I'm a survivor of unbelievable, relentless bullying, and keeping in mind that I am older, so I grew up at a time where bullying looked like something different. Imagine what kids would have done to me, had they had access to the internet back then. I'm thankful they didn't, because they did some pretty horrible stuff without it. But I survived bullying. I survived child abuse. I survived a bunch of other crazy things. It's really been a lesson in how trauma sets you up. Childhood adversity and childhood trauma set you up to see red flags where they don't belong and not see red flags where you should. And so you end up just getting traumatized again and again and again, because your brain doesn't have the ability to sort through threat and safety properly. And so lots of faulty neuroception, lots of like, God, how did I get here? And somewhere in that path, I also ended up getting some jobs that put me in the right directions. I got a job, literally I got a job as a receptionist, an office assistant for a mental health agency, where I got to sit in the back of the room and hear experts talk about trauma, experts talk about mental health, because I was the guy planning the training. But it also meant I got to take in all the work. And I just got kind of super interested in the brain. And honestly, because they were talking to me. Right. They were saying, kids who've suffered abuse and neglect and trauma and this and that end up with these issues. And I was like, oh, I have those issues. And I was like, okay. And then, add in the two violent hate crimes. It seemed like these workshops I was going to, not as a clinician, not as a mental health person, but as the training guy. And then I took all that information in and I started reading more and learning more. But then I also became a mediator, really just for fun. I loved the idea of mediation. I became a volunteer mediator. I went into small claims court. I loved small claims court with a passion. It was so much fun to help people sort through stuff and to learn the right questions, the right approaches. And then I also got a job as the associate director of a community mediation center,
Wow.
where they started sending me into schools to teach and set up peer mediation programs. So I would go in and I would teach anywhere from 5th grade up to 12th grade. I would teach students to be mediators. And I also saw that some of the best mediators I've ever seen were not volunteers at my mediation center. They were 5th graders and 6th graders who had just the ability to just be curious in a way that I didn't see adults doing. And that's a really strong thing for a mediator. I also saw how I saw teachers talking to some students. The punitiveness, the lack of compassion, the demands for compliance and obedience versus actually teaching discipline. And I at the time was a really big fan of Marshall Rosenberg's work of nonviolent communication. And I went to a principal and I said, look, can I train your staff in conflict and communication work, nonviolent communication? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, I'll do it for free. Like, just let me in. I was like, I got a paycheck for my job. Get me in your school and I'll do this work. And since the teachers already knew me from doing the peer mediation work, they were kind of like interested in it. I did the first workshop. The teachers were like, give us more, get us more. And I was like, oh, all right. Well, I'm going to have to like frame this differently and learn. But they also gave me the criticism. I needed to get into a classroom and spend more time with them. So I did.
That's great.
I was like, I'll come hang out in your classrooms. I think that would be great. And so I did. This went on for a couple of years, about 4 years. I did this work. And it was getting really popular in the districts around where our center served folks. And then I was also running some restorative justice court programs, some criminal court mediation programs where people who had gotten arrested for fighting or, other, offender victim type dialogues, and running those things. So if you got arrested, it was a first time offense. We put you into a mediation to help you work stuff out with the people involved. And if you could do that, the judge would nolly your charges. And so it was a way people could really look at accountability and look at ways to help community members solve their problems versus just sending them to prison or fining them or giving them probation. And it was way more effective. Unfortunately, like many really awesome programs, the funding got cut, which also is what paid for me. And so I ended up needing a job. And as I left the mediation center, some of the schools came back and said, well, we want to just keep paying you. Would you, can we just pay you? And I was like,
sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't have, it's not like I'm doing anything. So I was like, sure. And so I formed an LLC and some schools started coming to me and asking me, and it worked just like this. I'd go to a school, I'd work with the principal, I'd work with the team, and then the assistant principal would become a principal somewhere else. The first thing she would do is bring me there. And I literally, I could picture her face like the day she called me and she's like, remember we did the work there? Could you do that here? And it just spiraled.
That's
but
great.
It also meant I needed to keep diving into the work. I'm a total book junkie. And so I started reading and reading and reading and reading. And somehow that turned into where we are now, where I'm literally working with districts across the country. I'm working with some districts in Essex, England and the UK. I'm working with some partners. I'm going to collaborate with some people in Ireland. I'm definitely collaborating again with Marg Thorsborn out of Australia. And as you saw, I got this gift of being on a panel with people who I think are rock stars. And then here I am on that same panel with people who I think are rock stars, like Matthew Portell and James Moffat, who I think are just, these guys are giants. They know 10 times more than me.
Joe, I have to say, you are one of them. You are one of the rock stars. I was sitting outside of, off stage and looking up at all of the rock stars and having so much gratitude for all the work that you're doing and Matthew and others in terms of the impact of change. So you were absolutely one of them. And the work that you're doing, I mean, it's great to hear, kind of how this not only started for you, but how you've been able to kind of grow your impact and what you're doing. I want to kind of take a very, I don't want to say step backwards, but we have a broad audience here, and I'm getting yes here. You are one of the rock stars. So people
Hey, you
agree.
know who
And
said that? Wait, I have to pause on that. You know who said that?
what's
She's
that?
the most awesome human being. She is the second most awesome person in my entire world. That's my awesome sister.
Ah, okay, that's
She's not
fantastic.
lying. I still love her. Like, I love that she has that support for me.
Uh-huh.
I probably couldn't do this work if I didn't have her. And so I have to give her props that in order for any media to be where I am, I needed a support system around me. Like
That's great.
I'm a trauma survivor. I'm
Yeah.
still a child abuse survivor.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you all the reasons punishment's bad because it happened to me. But
Mm-hmm.
recovering from that, I needed a support system. And that's what we want kids to have, support systems. And for me, my sister is my support system, like 1,000 times over. She is
Absolutely,
my
that's
support
beautiful.
system.
And again, you just said it doesn't matter that we're related. You're really a rock star, and I agree. I agree. I mean, I've been I've been in the fan club for a while, so I can absolutely agree. And it's funny. I had a conversation with my sister earlier this afternoon, who called me. She had seen an article that the work that we're doing was mentioned in, and was calling me to just kind of say some really nice things. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate the value of that. I do want to let you know that as we mentioned, kind of as we began, we do have people from all over the world. We have somebody joining us from Portugal, and I'll tell you that my
And
wife's heritage is
Scotland,
yeah,
Oklahoma.
Scotland
Yeah,
as
I'm gonna
well.
say hi
Yep,
to like Scotland. That's awesome.
absolutely,
Scotland's in
absolutely.
Oklahoma. I love it.
And my wife's background is Portuguese, so one day we're hoping to visit. So keep that in mind. One day maybe we'll get out to Portugal. But we've got folks here from Scotland as well. And if you haven't told us where you're from, feel free to drop that in the chat. But I wanted to take kind of a step backwards, and we're gonna talk about your book. We're gonna talk about your work, and we have an audience here that is made up of a lot of different kinds of people. We have parents of kids that have been on the wrong side of restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, kids that have been led down the school to prison pipeline. We have a lot of self advocates in our community, and always a huge shout out to a lot of the autistic self advocates that are so active in our community and bring such valuable information. As you probably know, I'm a big fan of sharing lived experiences and understanding what people are going through. We have a lot of teachers, a lot of educators that are part of our community. Although we're trying to change things in terms of reducing things like restraint and seclusion and a lot of the negative consequences, we are very supportive of educators that are kind of on their journeys and moving in the right direction, and trying to bring people along. We get a lot of school administrators as well as attorneys and advocates and other folks. But I always like to start at a fairly basic level. And I wonder if you could just talk at a very high level. What is a restorative, what is restorative justice? What is a restorative program? So can you give a little bit of background for those that might not be really familiar? And again, more people showing up from Ontario and from Texas, and you and I were just in Houston recently. So to our friends in Texas.
Yeah, that's my first time in Texas. Think things really were bigger there. Um, I was like, wow, they weren't kidding.
Big airport.
So yeah, I don't know. I went to the smaller airport hobby, but it was
Okay.
still pretty surprising. Um, I think if I wanted to explain restorative justice, it's because there's especially in schools, the way we've explained restorative justice has been a little bit like it's been marketed and branded in the wrong way. And so I think it's led to some misunderstandings about what restorative justice really truly is. And so for a lot of people, restorative justice is this like alternative discipline program that we're putting into schools, or an alternative to the court programs where in our criminal justice systems, especially for kids. Where I'm also, aside from doing this work in schools, I have been doing a lot of work with our juvenile review boards here in Connecticut
Mm-hmm.
and our juvenile justice system in Connecticut. And again, I don't even like the term juvenile anymore. A really good friend of mine, Justin Carbonella, who I do a lot of work with, we've really looked at that word and said, why do we even, the only time we use the word juvenile to refer to bad kids. And so why do we name our diversion programs juvenile review boards? We're reviewing the bad kids. That's what it even sounds like. But restorative justice is really It comes in two parts. And the first part of it is this acknowledge of how interconnected we all are. That we're all related, whether we want to admit it or not. And that with that relationship, everything that happens with the people around you affects you, and you affect them. And that interrelatedness, interconnectedness, that's the heart of restorative justice and what makes it work. The other part of restorative justice is responding, not reacting, but responding differently to wrongdoing, to harm. And instead of seeing it as a break in the rules, that we have an offender, so we're offender focused, looking at what rule did you break and how do I punish you for breaking it. And so accountability is going to be painful. And so who wants that? How do you get people accountable when you think accountability is pain? But accountability should feel good. Accountability should be about healing and feeling better. When we hold someone accountable, if you really want to teach children discipline and the right things, then accountability's got to feel good. And restorative justice allows for that. It doesn't mean it, so it asks different questions. And so our old system said, who did it? What rule did they break? What law did they break? How do we punish them? But this new system says, wait, this isn't a break in rules. It's a break in relationship. It's community focused. We didn't just break a rule. We damaged relationships. And so the question that we ask is, what's the harm? Who's been harmed? In what ways have they been harmed? And whose obligation is it to clean that mess up? And so rather than saying, hey, you're the offender, you made a mistake, and it's up to you to fix it, we say, no, this is a community. You messed up. We want you to fix it. And by the way, we're right here to love you right the way. We're going to love you all the way through it.
Mm-hmm,
and so now accountability feels good because it means you're not cleaning up your mess on your own. Cleaning up with the people and the people that love you, help you. And maybe that is everyone, but then we also have to look at the systemic issues that caused you to act in the way you do so that we can clean that up. Because too often in our schools, the behavior we're seeing is in response to a school and a system that isn't meant for every kid. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, we talk about traumatized kids, we talk about, kids of color and BIPOC kids, and we say, and our LGBT students. When we have systems that are not set up for all students, then we have systems that cause behavior.
They cause trauma, right? And they cause trauma. I mean, if the system is not set up for you, the system could be traumatizing for you. And that traumatizing system, of course, is leading you to stress and distress-related behaviors, right? So the system is actually, great point. Yeah.
And teachers tend to think about trauma as what's happening at home. And that puts blinders on to the fact that for many of our children, the trauma is coming from school. Home's fine. It's school that's the trauma. And
that's such an important. Yeah, that's such an important point. I mean, we kind of find that when it comes to a lot of the negative things that are happening to kids, and restraint and seclusion is a really significant example of this, where a kid is physically restrained on a Monday and expected to return back to school on a Tuesday as if nothing happened. And, that is a physical act of aggression, and that is extremely traumatic. But there's often, and you're right, it extends well beyond things like that into the general trauma that might be happening in schools. And I often say, there's a real blind spot in schools to school-based trauma, and it sounds like that's kind of what you're getting at as well. Is there's a lot of things that can be causing kids trauma, and yet they're pointing at, well, it must be here, it must be there. Of course, we, are here to support kids. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm not, meaning that, but it really does, I think, puts kids in a bad position when people don't recognize the impact, even if it's unintentional, of trauma that might be being caused by the environment or by the people.
And even in it's hard to say this, because no one loves it when I say this, but the reality is, even within restorative justice.
Mhm.
And so when we take restorative practice, restorative justice, and we use these ideas and philosophies, which are beautiful, they're
Right.
amazing, and they need to be done through a trauma-informed lens, or you're going to circle those kids up
Right.
and
Right.
and re-traumatize. So it's not truly restorative
Right. Right.
unless we're really thinking about the impacts we have on kids.
Yeah.
Oh, so we don't want to circle them up for behaviors that were
Right.
actually them showing us their trauma
Right. So
or
you're
showing
actually
trauma
getting,
response.
you're getting to somewhere that I'm was trying to head here with a couple questions, and that, well, let me ask you one more question, then we'll get there. Um, so again, we have an audience, I think, that by and large has a pretty good understanding of what we mean when we say trauma informed. But I'd love to hear the Joe Brummer version of, when you say trauma informed, what do you mean?
Oh God, I think that changes from day to day as I keep
Well,
learning.
we'll
I
take
mean,
the latest and
especially
greatest
coming back
because
from a conference where I really think, I'm still doing the conference. Like this morning I
yeah.
listened to some of Stephen Porges, polyvagal
Yeah,
keynote, which I'm a huge polyvagal fan. And so
absolutely.
I was
Yeah.
just like, oh man, this guy's awesome. And I think when we really talk about it, I'm going to go back to Bruce Perry because, like a lot of trauma informed folks, I'm a Bruce Perry fan, and the
Mhm, mhm,
neurosequential model and this
mhm,
idea of state dependent functioning.
mhm,
And I think if we really wanted to summarize, like what is trauma, what does it mean to be trauma informed? And I think, and even going a step further to saying, how do you get to be trauma responsive,
mhm,
like, or
mhm,
trauma sensitive? It's like, and it's a journey. And I think the journey is about recognizing our nervous systems and our development are impacted by the experiences we have. And so to become trauma informed is to see the world through a lens. And that lens has to be that you are the product of all the experiences you've ever had.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
And so when I look at a kid that's, quote unquote, misbehaving or having a struggle to meet the expectations, what I might be seeing is a kid that lacks skills.
right.
I might be seeing a kid that doesn't have the capacity to learn right now because the things that have happened to them have made it difficult for them to keep their cortex open for business,
Mhm,
which is
mhm,
where learning happens. So if a kid can't actually access their frontal cortex and they're in the lower parts of their brain, they can't learn. And so, really, I guess if I was to sort of make up on the spot, like, what does trauma informed mean? It's to recognize brain states.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
to recognize that we are state dependent.
mhm, mhm,
And if you're in a state of fight, flight, freeze, faint, you can't learn.
mhm, mhm.
And so when we
Absolutely.
talk about schools,
Yep.
trauma informed means we've got a lens on people's state.
Mhm, mhm,
Where are you? Are you calm and relaxed and open for relationship?
mhm, mhm.
Can you learn?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And I think about the work of Stephen Porges that you mentioned with the polyvagal theory, and I think about Mona Delahooke, another favorite.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, love Mona,
I love
and
Mona. Mona's awesome. Yes.
yeah, and one of the nicest people you'll ever talk to. I mean, just incredibly authentic and just fantastic work. But I think about that premise of safety a lot, and what I'm always coming back to is that a child that does not feel safe, a youth that does not feel safe, cannot learn. A teacher that doesn't feel safe can't necessarily teach. Somebody, when you're not
Yeah.
feeling safe, safe is foundational to all the other things that we're doing. And when we're not feeling safe, the chance of being hypervigilant, the chance of having distress related behaviors increases astronomically. And it's just so foundational, but it's so often missing in the approaches that are being taken with kids. So, I was kind of lining you up to ask you a very specific question, which is that, again, kind of looking at your book, which again I want to mention to people. I already had somebody here saying Mandy, who I know, saying I'll have to. It's a book I'll have to get, and I would say yes, and all of you may want to get a copy as well. But again, looking at your book, building a trauma-informed restorative school. I think that there are sometimes assumptions that restorative justice might always be trauma-informed, and as I've heard you and others kind of talk about, that's not necessarily the case. And certainly I've seen myself things that fall under a, restorative justice umbrella that in fact do not appear to me at all to be trauma informed. So I think that the marriage of those two things together that you're talking about, to me, that's really significant. So I'd like if you would, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm getting this wrong here, but I'd like if
Oh
you
no,
would to share with me
you
your
got it.
experience and what you found related to this.
I think what sort of compelled me a little bit, because I'd love to say I decided I would do this, but that's not really how that worked for me. It's more like I felt like this compulsion to do this. But
Yeah.
if you look at what is being taught a- across the globe around restorative practices in schools, we're teaching things like effective statements. That's like one place I'll go. What people are teaching as effective statements are basically our old version of I statements, right? The I feel because you did. Well, that just sounds like a whole lot of blame to me. Guy, I'm feeling a little concerned and worried when you do X in the classroom.
I feel a little
And
defensive
now,
already.
now a little guy is going to be like, "What am I doing?" Like
Right.
you're actually bringing up and triggering kids, and why that doesn't work for kids who are traumatized is because they've already got this internal belief system that says, "I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm unlovable," and then you put them into a punitive atmosphere. And again, I'm going to go back to my buddy Justin Carbonella, who I do a lot of training with. He's a trauma-informed restorative practice got here in Connecticut. And he always says, look, what it works in like a cycle, right? We have kids that do something bad. And I put that in quotes. We have a kid that does something bad. So we treat them like they're bad. We punish them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so they believe that they're bad because we reinforce that with the punishment. Punishment
Hmm.
reinforces the belief that I am bad, I am unlovable, I mess everything up, because that's what's going through the mind of a traumatized kid. And so you got the cycle. I did something bad, so I think that I'm bad because they treat me like I'm bad. So now I believe that I'm bad. So I'm going to
Hmm.
do things that are bad because I believe that I'm bad. And now
Hmm.
they're going to treat me like I'm bad, and I believe that I'm bad. That's never going to end until
Right.
somebody
Right.
steps in and
Right.
ends it. The problem is we're not looking at our restorative practices and looking at how they are breaking that pattern, then the practices you are putting in place aren't restorative anymore.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
just perpetuating belief systems for a child that don't work.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
that whole idea, and I'm sure you've had a dozen guests on here that have said this. These punitive punishment reward behaviorism
Right.
responses, because
Right.
most of us at this point are just fighting behaviorism
Yep.
because it's out of step with the science, it's out of step with what works, and our schools are steeped in behaviorism. The problem is that when you go to a child who's struggling and you say, you offer them the punishment reward systems, those work fine for kids that don't need them.
Right. Amen.
But for the kids who actually
Right.
have the struggle,
Right.
that's the stuff making it worse.
Right.
And so at what point in time are we going to recognize that we're responding to the kids that have the struggle with stuff that doesn't work for them? I don't think it works for any kid, but the kids that come in with skills that
Right.
that come from relationally healthy places, yeah, they'll respond to that stuff and recover from it because
Right.
they've got resilience built in. But some of our other kids, the punishment reward systems just reinforce the negative belief systems that they already
Mhm.
had.
Mhm.
Those kids in your school
Right.
know that you call them those kids. Frequent
Yep. Yep.
flyers,
Yep.
high,
Yep.
the I'm
Mhm.
trying to think of the other names I've heard. Just, I've heard so many like negative ways of talking
Mhm.
about the regulars. You know, the discipline systems in our schools often target a small number of kids, like
Mhm. Mhm.
5% of your population of your school.
Mhm. Mhm.
Those kids that are causing discipline don't respond to these old methods.
Yeah. Well, and what happens, at least in my experience, and I think you'd probably agree, is sometimes these old methods, and when we say old, we're talking 1950s science here, right? We're not talking about, 1990s and beyond. We're not talking about all the research that's been done on the brain. We're talking about kind of operant conditioning and behaviorism. You know, and you're right, they're absolutely not working for kids that need it, and the kids that they might appear to work for don't need it. So it's not very effective, and even further, it can be really harmful. I mean, I think about personal experience, and I think about some of the most difficult days that my son, when he was very young, had at school, and they often involved a reward that never materialized. A reward my son might have thought he was working towards, but lost for some reason, and you know, he could not understand why that happened, and things went off the rail from there. You know, I think about, and I'm sure we're both fans of, you know, Alfie Kohn's work, and you know, kind of the idea of punish by reward, and the idea
Yeah,
that, you know, what's reward and punishment do? At best, it's short-term compliance, right? At best, you might get a, you know, a very short-term effect, but you know, if kids don't have that skill, if they don't have that knowledge, if they don't have that ability, you know, it's continuing to punish them for things that they
right.
shouldn't. And you know, I also think, you know, we often think about that word discipline, and I got to spend some time a week ago in a congressional hearing about several bills to address school climate. And I heard a lot of people talking about discipline and talking about consequence and talking about not being soft on kids. And, you know, I mean,
Right.
it
Yeah, yeah,
pains me to know we live in a world where people still think the answer is beating kids. And, you know, I say that as we have 19 states that still allow for corporal punishment. So this shift is so incredibly important. I mean, you know, I think we both see the outcome of this, that you know, the kids that are ending up down that school to prison pipeline are the same kids that are those kids, you know, as you mentioned. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So there's
And,
such
and so
important
that's
messages.
in, I think, if you know, of course, you're better at plugging my book than I am. Just I'm terrible at it. But here I will plug it. In the intro of my book, and for you're one of those, if any of you are any of those people that like jump right to chapter one, which I was guilty of till I wrote a
Mhm.
book. Now I'm like, wait, nobody's reading my preface, my intro. And if you didn't get her, especially my folks on this call, if I saw somebody from Australia, if you didn't read Judy Atkinson's forward, you missed some amazing stories about, you know, the ninja. I love the ninja story, I really do.
Mm,
But in the intro of the book, and in all of my workshops, we examine these four words: punishment, consequences, accountability, and discipline. Because we throw those things around like they mean the same
mhm,
thing.
mhm,
That
mhm.
kid needs some consequences. You
Right,
know, you
right,
meant punishment.
right,
And the funny
right.
thing is when you sit down with those words and you try to figure out like what those things mean and then how they're different, you start finding out that most people say they want consequences. They don't. They they want accountability.
Right.
And most of the people that say they want accountability will tell you that it means owning your actions and cleaning up your mess.
Mm, mhm.
But the reality is we equate accountability with punishment.
Right,
But
right,
I'll say the magic words. Punishment thwarts accountability. Period.
right.
Because the punishment makes accountability painful. But if you really want to teach a kid to be accountable, you got to make accountability feel good.
Mhm, mhm.
You got to make accountability like heart work. And so if you want that kid to be disciplined, they've got to know, you know, that things have changed. So it seems like, and I'm going to go back to my friend Justin again. I don't know why, he must be on my mind. He's probably going to call me later or something because he's in the back of my mind. And Justin would say to you, like, look, the measure of success used to be tears. When a
Mm, mhm.
kid felt so bad about what they have done that they've cried, we know we reached them. Now, the measure, when we get restorative justice in the picture, now the measure of accountability is hugs.
Mhm,
Did the
mhm, mhm.
kid walk away feeling like they were supported? They know how to clean up their mess. They own their actions and they clean. And it's like in my book, I borrow Carolyn and Boyce Watson and Kay Pranis's work and their definition of accountability. That it has these five dimensions. Like you got to own that you caused harm, and you got to know who you harmed and in what ways.
Mhm,
You
mhm,
got to
mhm.
repair that harm. Then you got to pay back your community for bringing
Mhm,
harm. And
mhm.
then most importantly, when we really talk being accountable, you got to show us how you're working on it to not
Mm.
have it happen again. That's funny how none of that involves actually suffering.
Right. Right.
Although I would say that it takes more out of a child or an adult to sit down with those you have harmed than it is to simply serve out your punishment.
Right.
There's nothing accountable about punishment. Because
Mhm.
if we all agree that accountability is owning your actions, I can serve out my punishment and never own what I've done.
Mhm. Mhm.
I
I
did
love
my
that.
time, but it meant
Right.
nothing.
Right. 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 Yeah. Or that didn't hurt, or that didn't, whatever.
Yeah.
I think you hear that. I
Or
love
I
you.
can take it. I can take it. And
Right.
next time I'll do it, I won't get caught.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. Making bigger problems. I love that you had the word teach in there when you were talking about accountability. And I'm always, I think it was Dr. Laurie Desautel's book, Connection Over Compliance, where I first read this and then was like, wow. And that was kind of the idea that the word discipline really comes from the Latin word, which is meaning to teach or to follow.
To teach.
And we
Yeah.
very often look at discipline as consequences, negative consequence. And how many times have we heard these kids need consequences? And I believe that there are a lot of educators out there doing amazing work that are using approaches, maybe working with schools that you've worked with and using approaches like restorative approaches and like trauma-informed approaches. But there are others that when they say they want consequences, they want the kid sent to the principal. They want something bad to happen to the child. So they're
They
still kind
want
of
retribution.
right, right, right,
Let's
right.
get honest.
Yep,
I love
yep.
when teachers are like, I don't want him to suffer. Yes, you do.
Right,
You
right,
know, that's and
right,
it's human. There is an actual,
right.
neuroscience backed notion that revenge is built into our systems.
Mhm,
It
mhm,
is,
mhm,
and it can feel really rewarding. The
mhm.
problem is it's not good for a child.
Right,
And so
right, right.
we've got to understand as adults, we are here to teach. And if you want to teach discipline, like every other subject you want to teach a child, it's going to take patience and
Mhm,
time.
mhm.
And
Absolutely.
so the idea that, again, we've all heard this, saying where you say, if you're teaching math and it's not working, you change your strategies.
Right.
You get a new approach and to help that kid learn math. But suddenly, if we're teaching them discipline stuff and it's not working, we just come up with more suffering.
Yeah.
And we expect it to work overnight.
Yeah.
We talked about this guy. Why are you still doing this?
Right.
Magically, I can learn these skills overnight because you
Right.
gave me a suspension.
Yeah.
It
Or
doesn't work that way.
we rebrand things that have been failing us for years. And I think about, again, what you were talking about all the, kind of punishment and rewards that are offered. And, there are ideas and programs out there that sound really positive. And then, again, I think that have the right intention perhaps, but really are causing harm. And I think about things like PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports. I always kind of joke, it sounds like a basket full of puppies, right? It sounds like a really good thing. It's positive, it's support. But
Yeah.
very often what we see, and again, I've talked to people, within the, kind of the committee that developed a lot of the PBIS framework. And at its heart, it might be a framework, but what we often see is that the behaviorism approaches that get baked into the actual interventions can be quite
Yeah.
harmful. There, it's the reward and punishment. It's the pizza party that the kids that didn't get a referral get to go to, but the kids that got a referral don't get to go to. It's not helping the kids to go get pizza because they wouldn't have gotten a referral anyway, and it certainly didn't motivate the
Yeah.
kids that may have gotten a referral. But there's a lot of kind of what's being used over and over and continues to fail us gets you. So it's so exciting to see people moving towards better approaches. And I think we both agree, because I think I heard you say something at the conference that I say some version of fairly frequently, which is you can't go to a 30-minute training and consider yourself trauma informed. You can't go to a 30-minute session on restorative justice and consider yourself to do that kind of thing. So I have a question for you, but before I do, I wanted just to get a couple of the comments here, and mainly comments right now. But I see my friend Floyd here that said, hell yes. It's so refreshing to hear this perspective of
And I
restoration.
think Gail has some really good questions going too.
And
'Cause
Gail is
it's such a
fantastic.
popular one.
Yeah. So Gail
That
is
question's so
someone
popular.
yes, someone I know well. She's a administrator in Australia and actually a member of our alliance team as well. And she said, loving it. The system could be part of, let's see, the system could be part of a behavioral school, can cause trauma. Yep. Okay. So kind of agreeing with that. People talking about the book, people talking about kind of the cortex being open for business. And again, people in Australia, Michigan, have somebody else here from the Gold Coast. That's Gail actually, but I keep Joe, and we've got to work on this. I keep telling Gail that I'd be happy to go to Australia to present at a conference, and Joe, I'd love for you to come too. We just need to find one to go to. Australia would be a
Oh,
great place to travel.
they're there. So the new chair of Restorative Practices International is Margaret Thorsborn, who of course
Yeah.
was one of the people that helped write this book, and I'm writing another book with. And I love Mark Thorsborn, and she's on the Sunshine Coast. She is out there, she's in.
Well,
not
let me know
exactly sure on
when
the
you're going
place.
next,
I'm
and
happy to
I'll help you
go.
with the bags.
I'm happy to go out to Australia. I've heard it's a really
Absolutely.
long plane ride, so we'll need to stop
Yes.
off somewhere on the way to rest ourselves, so we're not on planes forever. But I think, and I know that there are schools in Australia who are using the book, including there's the woman that Judy Atkinson talks about in the forward of my book, where she talks about this student who's sort of talked down and de-escalated by a really skillful principal. That principal's using my book as a framework for her school. And so I know the schools in Australia are actually using this book as framework. I know that schools in the UK are using this as a framework. I know schools here in the US that are using it as a framework. And it really does, so I think I would love to see this expanded into as many places as it could be, because I think it's a neat framework.
Yeah, and I mean, again, New Zealand, I've heard some great work happening there. I think about
Hale seems to have trained with Marg, big plus.
Yeah. So more connections here. This is absolutely great. A couple of more comments here to go over real quickly. Beth says, this is when we were talking kind of about the punitive approaches. Agree, it doesn't work for any kid. Self-discipline, autonomy. All right. So Gail had. So what do you think? Let's see. What do you say to those who think that if you do restorative practices, that you don't believe in consequences? How do you change the hearts and minds of ancient ways of thinking? So Joe, how do you change hearts and minds?
I got that one. So I love this because this question pops up all the time. So we're right back to what we just talked about, right? Consequences, accountability, discipline, and punishment. When people say that we don't believe in consequences, which I cannot tell you the number of people that have come to trainings with me, spent lots of time with me, and then later say to me, "Oh, Joe, I know you don't believe in consequences." And I'm like, how did anybody deduct that from anything I've ever said? Because in fact, I believe in using the consequences. That is the heart of restorative justice. That when we sit down with a child who has messed up, the first thing we admit is we all mess up. And then it's the idea that accountability is to look at the actual consequences and then use those to clean them up. So let's think about that. What are consequences? You go out in the rain, you get wet. You hurt your friends, they're not going to be your friends. Right. You break something, you broke it. The consequences were there all along. You can't make that stuff up. But what accountability is what people really want. When I ask people what's the definition of punishment, they always come back and say the same stuff. Suffering. Number one, it's suffering. Two, which you already know if you've read my book, that I think punishment is violence. You are actually asking another human being to suffer so you get to feel better about what they did. That's just violence. You have no moral right to ask another human being to suffer for you. Now, it's also the difference between shame and guilt. Punishment is steeped in shame. Guilt, which is actually a very healthy, feeling, that's what restorative justice works on. We're taking a kid that feels guilty and a little bit sad about maybe their actions and says, yeah, why don't we use that to help you clean it up? And so what consequences start to look like are things that make sense to what actually happened. Oftentimes punishment isn't actually connected to what happened. And so how are kids going to learn a lesson? Consequences are connected because they came from the event. Right. And, again, we had a great conversation with Secretary Cardona at the conference where, we talked about the work that we did here in Connecticut, where we really taught educators to say, if you want consequences, they're there. And why do you have to make up new ones? Why don't we just go to the ones that already exist and use those to teach? because kids can connect to actual consequences. They're going to have a hard time picking the pieces up when you go, look, go home for 3 days. And they're like, how does that relate exactly to me yelling at my teacher?
Right.
They're not connected. But now,
Yeah.
what if we went to that same kid and said, look, we want you to sit down with this teacher. I want you to understand her feelings, and I want you to understand the impacts of your actions. And then once we know those impacts, I need you to clean them up.
That's great. That's great. So yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit here, and I'm already imagining, and I think with probably good reason, that some of the people that are watching this today are thinking maybe they're a parent, maybe they're an educator in a school system. But I wanted to ask you a question, kind of from that frame. If I'm a teacher or if I'm a parent, and I think, wow, this work sounds really interesting. I am going to go out and get a copy of Joe's book. But if I think, hey, I'd love to know what is involved in bringing this kind of approach to my school, can you tell us a little bit about what it looks like? What would, if I'm an administrator and I call you and say, hey, Joe, I'd like to, I'd like to, begin looking at how we can, kind of transform what we've been doing in relation to discipline, how we can bring in kind of a trauma-informed restorative approach. Can you talk us through what that might look like, or how even a teacher or parent might get involved in helping to affect change wherever they might be?
Yeah, and I think parents and students have to be involved. I think student voice is incredible. Parent voice is incredible. We can't do this work without a community, because relational, how healthy is the relational ecology of this school, of this district? The relationships around a child are the biggest, factor we have into how healthy this child is going to be. And so when people want to bring this to their school, I believe is a process. And I talk about this in the book. I definitely talk about it on my website. And then, of course, there's a session I just did, it's the first time I've done this session, that really said, how do we do this with a change management lens? Like, how do you make change? And, whether that's getting people to adopt new technology, or getting people to do something different, how do people adopt change? And so I think we need that change management lens. But you got to figure out where your starting point is. And that is, figure out where you are. Like, what have you already got going in your school that might be considered trauma-informed and restorative? Might even just be a couple of things. You've got something to build on. Next, get a team. You need a team in your school. Committee, whatever you want to call them. With that has to trump all the other committees you've got. So if you've got a PBIS committee, school climate and culture committee, discipline committee, and none of those people are talking, you got to dismantle that system because it's not working. Now we need a system that's an umbrella, because this has to be a priority. I've never seen a school succeed in this stuff if it was not their priority. You can't become trauma-informed if you're worried about 3 other things. If the priorities you have are academic over social and emotional learning, this is never going to work for you. You got to set up your priorities straight. And I've really gotten a lot more, I know, pushy is the way. Like, I feel like we really need to be stronger in the messaging that creating a trauma-informed restorative school is not, it's not an either or. It's like, we can be really academic or we can be social emotional learning. And it's really to start thinking, how do we do the academics through social emotional learning? Because that's how you get that frontal cortex open to learn. And that academic stuff, it's a frontal cortex stuff. And so it's whole body learning. It's like, how do we keep this kid regulated? Are they fed? Did they get some sleep? Is that behavior we're seeing? We have to look at the causes of behavior and stop trying to control behavior. So
I'll give you another amen
control,
here.
it's like,
right.
We've got to start looking, and that's Ross Green's work. That's Bruce Perry's work. That's Mona Delahook's work. I mean, I could go on and on. Like, this is the direction that everybody's going, because we had the 90s. We had the decade of the brain. We know the neuroscience, and we know that punishments and rewards only affect motivation. But what if motivation isn't the problem? And in most of the cases of student behavior, motivation is not the problem. Students, it's not that they're not motivated or don't want to do the work. And I heard Stephen Porges talk about this morning, where he says, look, a lot of kids that are apathetic about their studies are apathetic not because they don't want to do the work. It's because trauma kills curiosity.
Mm.
How can you be curious about the world when you can't even feel safe in it? And so, are we addressing the actual problems for students? So instead of dangling some behavior bucks and carrots and sticks in front of a child, address why they're apathetic, and stop trying to motivate them. You can motivate it to instead tap natural curiosity. Kids are naturally curious. And so if they don't want to learn what it is you want to teach, it's because you haven't tapped their curiosity. You like, what? Why should I learn this? But kids are actually if you can tap their sense of awe and wonder and curiosity, then you can bypass what trauma has done to them, which is shut down curiosity, shut down awe and wonder. Because when you're too worried about the bus that's about to hit you, you don't have a chance to be curious. In order to learn like science and be in awe of how rain comes, or what kind of cloud that was, or what kind of organ does what in the body, all that really amazing stuff that, you know, many kids are really curious about, you have to make sure that they're safe enough to be curious.
Right.
And we know the safety comes from relationship.
Right. And safe enough that they feel safe. You know, I think people sometimes have the tendency to think, well, this is a safe environment. They're safe here. They're putting their own lens on someone else's experience or feelings. You know, and I think that goes to the importance of, you know, those relationships and those questions and talking to people, because that's such an important thing. I mean, we may not think the environment is feeling unsafe, or we may not see some of the challenges in the environment. And, you know, in the work that we do, there are a lot of, you know, a lot of the kids that are being affected by many of these same things, whether it's, you know, discipline or, you know, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, all of those things. We have a lot of kids with disabilities. We have a lot of Black and brown children. We have a lot of very young children, you know, kind of all being impacted by this. And again, you know, when we talk about that, there may be things in the environment that are causing kids a great deal of stress. And, you know, when stresses begin to accumulate, you know, that sense of safety can also be affected. So, you know, I think it's really important, you know, not just because, you know, you as a well-regulated adult might think that something's safe, understanding kind of the lens that people are going through. I think that's really critical as well. All great points there. And the other thing that I love that you do, because, you know, I started doing this work probably about 3.5 years ago, and coming from a much different background. I did have a science background, but not a neuroscience, you know, not kind of in this area. But, you know, having been looking at the different work being done out there, from your work to Ross Green or Motodella Hook or Stephen Porges or Stuart Schenker, you know, it's seeing all of these things and how they fit together. You know, I love that in your book, for instance, you talk about collaborative and proactive solutions and some of these other approaches, but they all really begin to work together when you look at kind of the beginning and safety, and you look at the you know, kind of our autonomic nervous system and all of that, into stress and into lagging skills and unsolved problems. So, you know, I think when a lot of people think about restorative justice, they think about a circle and they don't think about anything beyond that. So it seems like you take a really holistic approach in all of this. It's not, I mean, in understanding the science. So, I mean, is that one of the things that, you know, has really influenced your work, is just kind of hearing and seeing all of this that seems to be so related to safety, trauma, and well-being?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think one of the things I feel really, you know, and I've heard this from people a lot over years, is that I'm not an academic. I'm not a professor. I don't have an advanced degree in anything other than I'm a book junkie who loves, and I have curiosity. And so I don't feel like I have to live in a box, and which I think a lot of us do live in those boxes in academic worlds and in school settings, where we pull all our information from educational psychology, or we pull all of our information from this discipline or that discipline, where I don't live in that box and I don't want to. And so I don't mind pulling stuff from educational psychology, and then neuroscience, and then the science on motivation and organizational theory, and like, because all of that stuff applies to schools.
Right.
Schools are like stomping grounds for everything. And
Hmm.
so there's no one trick that's going to work. Human beings are not so simple that, we can fall into a little box. Like
Hmm.
we need multiple approaches that approach social emotional learning, that approach school structures. But we always have to understand that if you want a child to feel safe, there's a lot to that.
Hmm.
It's not
Hmm.
just a matter of, having them feel like nothing bad's going to happen.
Right.
It's making sure that their sensory perception is not going to be on overload. It's making sure that our classrooms are set up in a way that their sensory can actually deal with it, that their brains are still developing and that can't take in an overwhelm. It's also really looking at the fact that we could pull from all these different places and set up a very holistic school. But that also means that we're going to have to say, hey, what's my school's connection to the food bank? Hey,
Mm.
what's my school's connection to the local mental health agency? What's my school's connection to some people that can help make sure that the electricity is on at home? Safety for children is based in relationships. And so, what are the relationships this child has? And
Hmm.
so, there is no child is going to feel safe. You can put everything safe in the world around them, but without the actual people, relationships,
Right. Right.
that's what makes kids feel safe. They need relationships based in unconditional positive regard.
Hmm. Hmm.
Say to
Could,
this
could,
kid, hey, no matter
yeah.
how much you mess up, I got your
Right.
back, and that
Right.
they trust us. And
Right.
there's another weird thing about relationships, and you might have heard me say this the other day. There's so many teachers that say that relationship is, I know my students really well. Okay, look, when one party knows the other party really well and not vice versa, that's not a relationship. That's called stalking, and it's illegal in most places. And so
Mm-hmm.
stop stalking your students. Don't go on this path where you know your student really well, but they don't
Mm.
know you.
Right. Yep.
Relationships
Yep.
are based
Yep.
in vulnerability.
Yeah.
They
Wow.
can't
Wow.
trust you if they don't know you.
Right.
And if they
Right.
don't
Right.
know you, they can't like you and
Right.
trust you.
Right.
They're never going to feel safe with you. And
Yeah.
you hear teachers are like, well, I can't share all of that with them.
Right.
Yes, you can.
Yeah,
You can
that's
be
such a
vulnerable.
fantastic point, and it really resonates with me for a lot of reasons. One is one of the things I often say, and I know I'm not the first to probably say this, but when I think about the three R's of education, I think relationship, relationship, relationship. It's so critical, and having had an experience with my son where he was traumatized significantly at a school and is now in a school where they're very relationship driven, where they are trauma informed, and I mean beyond the 30-minute training, where they broadly kind of get these things. And over time, he's been in the setting for, I guess this is his third year, and he's had some support, some people that he's been working with that are really open and share, and that's meaningful to him. Like, to get a response like, well, I can't share that with you. He doesn't connect to make a relationship that way. None of us do, right? If I said, well,
Yeah,
Joe,
yeah.
can you tell me this? You're like, well, we had a kind of a boundary there. I can't tell you that. But he would sometimes push that. But once he had that connection with people, the trust, the knowing that it's reciprocal and that people care about you and are vulnerable with you, so meaningful. So can I ask you, and again, I don't mean to delve into kind of a personal question here with this, but what I've often seen is that people very often in their journeys, somewhere along the line, it was that person that formed a relationship or that person that was vulnerable with you. I mean, was that your experience? Was there somebody that kind of helped you? And I know you mentioned, your sister, but I was just kind of curious if you had any experience like that, that a relationship was really pivotal for you.
Um, yes, yes, and of course, it's good to be a teacher.
Hmm.
Um, and so I did have a teacher, a fifth grade teacher in school who just sort of like took me on um, and just, I don't know, she just helped me, and unfortunately we lost her to breast cancer, which is
Oh
awful.
gosh.
And
Oh.
but she had to, I went to Catholic schools, and so when I was in seventh grade, I went back to my fifth grade teacher and I said, will you be my confirmation sponsor? And like, she was just somebody who I had a relationship with. Even after I graduated grammar school, she
Mhm.
stayed in touch. And then I got into high school, and of course I'm this 5'3" high school student who's obviously gay, and every kid in this, even though I wasn't ready to say I was gay in high school, every other kid figured it out just
Right.
quickly. And so I got, bullied a lot. And I had this music teacher who would let me use her classroom, which I'm sure was not, there was a piano in that classroom, and that's what regulates me. Like if I
Mm-hmm.
sit down at a piano and play, I feel regulated. And so on all of my lunch breaks and stuff like that, I had this wonderful teacher named Florence Murtha who would let me sneak into her classroom all by my little lonesome self to just play the piano and get
Mm-hmm.
through my day. And since it was lunch, it meant I had a place to hide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I've had teachers, but I think throughout my life, and then I'm not gonna lie, I know I said this earlier, and she's probably still listening. Like the regulating person in my life, and the person that has given me unconditional love that I've always believed. That was a really hard thing for trauma folks. Is that it's like when you're growing up as a trauma survivor, it's hard to trust people when they say I love you. But the
Mm-hmm.
one person who I never doubted is my sister. She's,
That's
a
amazing.
little over 2 years older than me. But when my sister says I love you, I've never doubted her. And in fact, she doesn't even have to say it, and I know it. Like I
Yeah.
believe it. And the
Yeah.
fact that I've always believed that, my sister has been my rock throughout my life. I don't even want to imagine what my life would be like not
Mm-hmm.
having that support system in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
she's always been there. Hell or
Mm-hmm.
high water, she's been there. And so I think every child needs to have someone in their life that, come hell or high water, is got unconditional positive regard. And notice I didn't say unconditional love, because I think
Mm-hmm.
love for a lot of our traumatized kids is such a loaded word. And
Right.
so kids need unconditional positive regard that says no matter how much you F it up, I still am going to be here for you, and I've got your back.
Right.
And
Right.
a lot of our students don't have that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and thank you for sharing that. I know that was kind of diving in deep, but I think that the reason I wanted to ask is that, in the stories and experiences that I have, from many others and my own life, it is that person. It is that person that really provided that to you, where it seemed like the world wasn't, and what a huge difference that can make. And go back to Dr. Perry talking about the healing power of just a single relationship. But
Yeah.
but it really is true. And I I feel for the kids that have not found that person or don't have that person. And I know, in listening to you recently at the conference that we both attended, that a lot of what you're doing is for even kids that you relate to now based on your own experiences. And even though things might be different now in schools, there are a lot of kids going through a lot of the same challenges. And you brought up a couple of really good examples at the conference, but it sounds like that's a really big part of your mission as well, is to help those that you can relate to their experiences. So I appreciate you sharing that. I know it's kind of a challenge, but I think that for all of us, anybody that's in education, and sometimes it seems all overwhelming. And, I think about the fact that sometimes in this work, we want all this change to happen tomorrow, right? The
Right.
changes that we're looking for, we'd like it to happen, yesterday, really. But even though we may not do everything tomorrow, that one student that you might connect with or support can make a lifelong difference. And I think that's such an important thing. We don't need to just be overwhelmed, but we can't do it all. Let's head in the right direction, but make that small change that can make a big difference, right?
Right. You only
Yeah.
need one. You only need one person to come in your life and to counteract that belief system that I'm not lovable.
Right. Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
that's a part of trauma, unfortunately, for kids, because children are egocentric, and
Hmm.
so when bad things happen to them, they don't stop loving the people that are hurting them. They stop loving themselves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so it only takes one person to come along and help them break that belief system,
Hmm.
to say,
Hmm.
oh, wait a minute, this one person loves me, so I must have a little bit of hope. I
Right.
must be a little bit lovable because this person loves me.
Right.
And again, when we talk about those relationships, when we talk about love, just because a bunch of adults in the building think that that kid has relationships around them
Hmm.
means nothing unless that kid believes it.
Right.
And
Right.
so, we really have to stop thinking that I knew a kid that I worked with here in Connecticut who he was a seventh, eighth grader in one of the first schools I worked in. and this kid, we nicknamed him MG. And I would ask him all the time, and I'd be like, I saw him all the time, and I didn't really work directly with a lot of students, but I did this particular one, and I would ask him all the time. I was like, who in this building has your back? Like, who can you go to and you feel connected with? And you always be like, no one. And then it's been years since then, but I actually realized one day, I was like, wait a minute, kid, you had me. I came every time I was in the building, I checked in with you. Even though that wasn't that often, I was there. He couldn't see it. He had people that believed in him. He had people with him, but he didn't believe in it.
Right.
And so we have to stop thinking, well, I've got that kid.
Right.
If that kid doesn't believe in that, it ain't helping. You have to make sure that kids believe that you've got their back, that they're loved and that they're lovable. And for some of those kids, you are up against a belief system that is so deeply entrenched in I'm not lovable. I mess everything up. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, we've blown through the first hour in no time flat, it seems like. And I think the first time I talked to you, it was kind of like this. And I could probably hold you for a 3-hour conversation fairly easily, but I want to be mindful of your
I'm not
time.
concise.
Well, no.
Nature to be concise.
Yeah, no, and neither of us are probably gifted with that, so it's all good. But I did want to ask you kind of one other question, or kind of bring up one other topic before we kind of wrap things up, and that is, I had known previously that that you had worked with our current Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, and of course at the recent conference that we attended. I'm assuming you probably had a little something to do with the very special guests that we had there, and the panel discussion. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for asking for input and bringing up a question regarding restraint and seclusion. But I learned quite a bit in not only the responses to the questions that were asked, but also in the introduction and the lead up, and hearing about the relationship that you had. And I found a lot of signs and signals for hope. So I guess my question for you, that's me not being very concise, right, is can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to have a relationship with our current Secretary of Education, and kind of what your thoughts are? Because, to me, again, I left with a lot of hope. I appreciated the response to all the questions that were asked. Of course, the question about restraint and seclusion was very near and dear to my heart, but I was really pleased to see him acknowledge the impact of trauma that these things have, acknowledge that these things are too often used as a primary, intervention, rather than something that should be used much, much later. I appreciated the sincerity. So could you tell us a little bit more about how all that came to be, and what your thoughts are kind of going forward?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So it was back in 2015, which is when I sort of left the nonprofit world, and schools came to me and they're like, all right, well, we'll just pay you. And I had been building this reputation with schools, and so I put up a website, and apparently a couple of principals in Meriden Public Schools who were looking to do this work and looking at trauma-informed, looking at restorative practices, on my website, thought, this guy looks like he's doing the right stuff. And so they set up a meeting between me and then Assistant Superintendent Miguel Cardona. And so I go to meet with this guy, and I have this awkward thing. I don't even know who this guy is, and I'm not really sure why I'm here, other than to talk about restorative practices. I don't really know much more than that. And so I show up for the meeting in this weird little round room that is his office at Meriden Public Schools, and we meet. And the first thing that I recognize about this guy is that he's just met me, and he's treating me like he's always known me. And I'm like, and it just felt nice. I was like, this guy's so nice. But we talked, and he's very honest. He's very focused. And when we started talking about how to make this work, I knew a lot about restorative justice. I knew a lot about trauma-informed. I was beginning to learn about how to make change in schools. But Cardona had a plan. He was like, nah, we're going to do it this way. And this is how we'll be able to reach the teachers. And I would sit down with him, and I'd be like, all right, well, here's my ideas. And he's like, yeah, the teachers aren't going to take that. We got to go this way. And I'd be like, okay, I'm in. And we just work together. But here's what also really surprised me. We set up 2-day trainings at each of the secondary schools in his district. So 4 secondary schools. And if you happen to be watching the virtual part of the conference, which is happening as we speak, I believe it's tomorrow at 3, like one of the principals from those schools is going to talk and tell the story of what we did in his schools. But Miguel would show up to the trainings, not like a lot of assistant superintendents and sort of like admin people do, where they show up to say, hey, we support you here at central office, and then they vanish. Miguel didn't do that. If it was a 1-day training, Miguel might show up late for the training, but he stayed. He participated. He helped back up the points. When teachers had concerns, he jumped right in to address those concerns and say, how do we collaborate on a solution? He was all about collaboration. He was all about trying to find the answers, but he was also interested in hearing people's concerns. And so he tells people that he learned about restorative and trauma-informed from me. I learned about teacher concerns from him. I learned about making stuff happen in schools from him. And I think we were just a good team to get some stuff done. And then, truth be told, I didn't tell this story at the conference. If you go back to the program for the very first Creating Trauma-Sensitive Schools conference, you will see that it was the first time I was going to present there. And my co-presenter was Miguel Cardona. And like the day before I was getting ready to jump on the plane, I was with train, it was in DC. I was going to get on the train to DC, and I get this message from, Cardona saying, yeah, I can't go. I got so much happening here at the district, I can't go. You're going to have to do it yourself. And I was like, I don't know if I could do this myself. And
so
I
maybe
ran
he
to do
owed
it by myself anyway. He ditched me. So then the conference came up, and I went back to his number, and I'm like, I don't even know if his old phone will work, because now he's like the big guy. And so I sent him this text message, and I'm like, oh, you know that conference you ditched me at? I need you to keynote as secretary. And he came back, and he's like, I'm in. And so he came back, and we came up with this platform that he's going to do some remarks, and we're going to do Q&A. And we really wanted it to be organic, but he said right from the start that this mattered to him. Like, in all the places he's been asked to speak, this is one that like he cares about. He believes in this stuff. And I could say it over and over and over again. He's not just some politician. He's an educator with 20 years experience of being in classrooms, of working in education, decades of understanding, working with UConn's School of Education. Like, this guy is one of us. And he's an amazing human being. And I know that he's got to like probably toe a party line and but he's doing it. He's still got people like you and me in the back of his mind, and he's still one of us. I say that fighting back a little, like I'm definitely choking back, like a little bit of how much that moves me, because it gives me hope. Like, I know, like, he actually had a picture on his Twitter account of him holding this book. I saw that, and I was like, man, this guy's like the guy that's going to lead this nation's schools, a guy who's trauma-informed, believes in restorative practices, prioritizes equity and social emotional learning. Who the hell would be better?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No corporate background. This guy's one of us. He's an educator. He's trauma-informed. We have hope.
Yeah,
we have hope.
Agreed. And I could feel that. I mean, I've seen and been around enough kind of DC mindsets to have a natural amount of skepticism, but that is not what I saw or felt or heard.
No.
And please share my gratitude when you have the opportunity to do so. I think that him showing up to that and really providing, I think, thoughtful and sincere answers really meant a lot. And I hope that in the coming years that with those of us that might be in the back of his mind, that can make a positive difference. I saw a question here from our friend Beth Tolley, and Beth asked, and this is not a surprising question to me, have you had any opportunity to discuss PBIS with him? But
so I'm going to tell you a story about that. I'm going to tell you a story about that. So
Okay.
we were doing it. This is years ago. I hope he doesn't mind that I'm going to tell this story, although I think he'd think it's funny. So I'm doing a training in Meriden. I don't remember. I want to say we were at the Platt School. It might have been either Platt High School or one of the schools in Meriden Public Schools. And we're doing the training and we're talking about PBIS and the training and behavior bucks. And Miguel starts laughing. And I'm like, I'm looking over and I'm like, I have no idea why he's laughing. So I just kind of carry on with the training. And he's like, Jojo, I want to tell him a story. And I'm like, all right. And this is what he always did during trainings. He would just sort of like, bump in and tell stories to help co-train with me. He always helped and backed me up. And he said, look, I want to tell everybody a story. Look, years ago when I was a principal and we started doing PBIS and we gave people like the behavior bucks, the coupons and the tickets. He said, what the kids were doing is they were going home and using their parents' laser color copiers to counterfeit behavior bucks. And of course he busted them for it. And he's like, but it shows you right off the top how rewards promote unethical behavior.
Right.
And that's what Miguel wanted to do. And the funny thing is Miguel and I have talked about PBIS, and he agrees a lot with me in the sense that there's a lot of really good stuff in PBIS. And if it was done with the fidelity to all the keys, because there's like, what is it, 7 keys or something, I forget them all, like reteaching, values-based work, you need to be focused on values and what those are. You often know you're in a PBIS school because they have like, the values written with, very catchy, respect, responsibility, blah, 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 It's all very cute, but if that stuff's not connected to the kids and the kids aren't connected to it, it stops working. And Miguel was behind that stuff. And for those of you that are in the listening and they don't know what PBIS is, it stands for positive intervention behavior systems. Basically, if you were to actually use some of the cool stuff like the reteaching and the modeling and like cool stuff, it's not horrible. And there are people that are combining restorative justice and PBIS. The problem that we have though, PBIS is still behaviorism. And behaviorism, again, PBIS works for some kids who probably don't need it. But the kids that it really works for, it doesn't work, and here's the reason why. And I'll go back to Heather Forbes. Heather Forbes and Jim Sportleader in their book, The Trauma-informed School, talked about sort of the window of tolerance, right? You have 2 kids, one of them who's experienced some traumatic events in their life and one of them who hasn't. They both have the same breaking point, but one of them's closer to it all the time because they're always carrying a little more stress. Most of that stress toxic. So if you go to the kid that's never experienced a lot of trauma and has space in their system for a little extra stress, punishments and rewards are probably going to be fine for them. I still think there's better ways to do this stuff, but they have room for that. But remember, adding the promise of a reward or the threat of a punishment comes with additional stress. Because think about a kid who wants that. And they're like, oh, there's a prize? I can get a prize. Oh, how do I get the prize? I never get prizes. How am I going to do something to get the prize? I'm probably going to mess this up. You're now taking their stress level up. Are you going to get better behavior? No. You're going to cross the breaking point and get worse behavior. So while people think these punishment reward systems work, they add stress to kids that have no capacity for that stress. So again, punishments and rewards work for the kids that don't need it. But it doesn't work for the kids that do.
And I saw Beth brought up another point, which I think is a really good one. I know that, you're also a big fan of Stephen Porges' work and, getting from Stephen and Nimona and talking about kind of the, the idea that, some of these programs consider all behavior to be intentional. When in fact, we know that all behavior is not intentional. There's behaviors that are kind of coming bottom up from a lack of safety or trauma or other things. And
just using my pet peeve.
Yep. And using those kinds of systems. And, as you're talking about that and you're talking about the stress, I'm also thinking about how many kids out there have anxiety. How many kids out there with disabilities is anxiety part of some of the challenges that they might have. I mean, my son certainly had a lot of that, and those behavioral approaches really were damaging. And I think again, there are many, and there are many. I remember talking to once with George Chagai, one of the primaries behind PBIS, and I think there's a lot of good ideas and intent. But I think
Right.
the concern that I always have is within the framework, not having that space for non-volitional behaviors, assuming that all behavior follows kind of that behaviorist model, and having a lot of reward and consequence-based models. But I've had other conversations with people like Mona de la Hook about, how PBS, while certainly not maybe serving a lot of kids well, it may be better than what they were doing before.
Right.
Some places now doing PBS are doing things better than what they were doing before. So it really is complicated. It's not just
It's
a
just a
matter of
journey.
right,
You heard Matt Portell talk about that at the conference in his keynote speech. This is a journey.
right.
And so maybe in the beginning of this, and even look at Edtopia video or Edutopia, the
Hmm,
Fall
hmm.
Hamilton
Yep.
school, trauma, this is what a trauma-informed school looks like. And even Matt will tell you that some of the stuff featured in that video isn't actually trauma-informed. He was doing this check-in, check-out system with a points system.
Right. Right.
Points are a reward.
Right.
Praise is a reward.
Right.
These things don't work for all children. I'm super
Right.
against praise.
Yep.
But I
Yep.
love how you touched on the choices thing too, because that's a pet peeve of mine, where I'm constantly hearing educators say, "Oh, little guy Stevens just made some poor choices," as if
Big
all
guy Miss
behavior
Stevens
is a
makes poor
choice.
choices too, by the way.
Let me tell you something. When you throw a ball at somebody, they're going to duck. That wasn't a choice, it's a
Right.
reflex.
Right.
Many of the behaviors that we see from children when thrown into fight or flight aren't making poor choices. They have actual reflexes. They are showing you their fight or flight responses that for many of those kids are easy to trigger.
Hmm,
And
hmm.
so we really have to so now you go back to Bruce Perry's work, the neurosequential model, functioning. We've got to recognize the state that a kid's in. And are they calm and open, and their cortex is open for business? And you think of
Right.
this, the brain as this layered cake in this
Hmm,
neurosequential
hmm.
model. The cortex is at the top of the cake. So you got the brainstem, the cerebellum, the limbic, and then the cortex is at the top. But when kids are under stress, that shuts down. The first thing your brain shuts off when you're under stress to protect you is
Yep.
thinking.
Yep.
Because while you're off thinking about the threat, it gets you. Like,
Right.
you don't think
Right.
and you act. The
Right.
brain is wired to act before you think. So there's no poor choices. Kids just act. And
Mhm.
sometimes under stress, and I always do this, right? This is the way I say it, everybody. You can have stress or you can have a cortex open for business, but you can't have both.
Mhm, mhm,
So
mhm.
you add stress, you lose cortex. You want the cortex, you got to lower stress. And
Right.
that's it. And
Right.
that means regulation.
Right.
And so regulation means all core regulatory systems are in order. They're
Mhm,
balanced.
mhm,
You're
mhm.
you're not hungry.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're well slept. You're safe. You're rested. You're loved. Now the cortex is open for business. You're
Mhm.
regulated.
Yeah.
But as soon as those systems go out of balance, you're hungry. You haven't slept. You're
Right.
tired. You're stressed. Now the cortex is going to shut down.
Right.
That's why you walk around the house trying to find out where your phone is. I can't find my phone. I've been looking everywhere. Dope, you're on it.
Right.
And why do we not do it? Because we're stressing.
Right.
And the
Right.
cortex is shutting down and we're doing dumb stuff. We're adults.
Yeah.
How many of us have run around our house frantically looking for our keys? You know why you couldn't find them? You're stressed. Calm down and you will find them. Regulate your nervous system.
I had to marry my phone to my wallet, and that simplified my life a little bit because now I can say, I used to always say wallet, phone, keys before I left the house. Now the wallet is with my phone. If only I could get the key in there too, I'd be all set. But yeah, I mean, this is great, and I think really important things to get out there. I've been going through some of Stuart Schenker's work recently, and actually participating in one of the online classes that they offer through the Merit Center on self-reg, and self-reg is self-regulation. Really kind of gets into that equation heavily about stress and about
Right.
the concept of homeostasis, which goes back to my biology days. And homeostasis is kind of trying to keep things at a certain level, like our temperature. We maintain a homeostasis, and stress is the same degree. When we begun to get out of sync, and we're not able to maintain that kind of homeostatic or kind of evenness, that leads to a lot of difficulties, and that leads
Right.
to stress responses and all of these things. And I think for people to move beyond the idea of just measuring the external behaviors and responding to them, to understanding the state and understanding stress and understanding the role of the brain is so critical. And you know what? Joe, you and I are two guys that I can think that can speak to this. It doesn't mean you have to be a neurologist. I mean, if you understand a basic amount about how the brain works and how the brain handles and reacts to stress, it changes the entire picture of how you respond, probably to everyone, but especially when working with and supporting kids.
I think the easiest model I've ever, I mean, I've read lots of models of the
Right.
Truman brain. I've read,
Mhm.
definitely the polyvagal sort of approach to the brain. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model that just is it's this triangle that shows
Right.
you the layers of the brain.
Yep.
Like I learned about that when my first book I read from him was Born for Love.
Mhm, mhm,
Why empathy is essential and endangered, or something like that. I don't remember the whole title. And I loved that book, and it introduced this model to me. Then
mhm,
I
mhm,
read The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and I saw the model again, and it was clicking for me, but there was something missing for me.
mhm,
And
mhm.
then this new book with Oprah Winfrey,
Oh, yeah.
called What Happened to You. And
Yep,
so it's that
yep.
whole Sandra Bloom thing. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you.
Right,
And this
right.
time around, I read that book, and like, I don't know how many lights went off in my head. It was like a fireworks show inside my head reading that book,
Mhm,
to a point where even on a personal level, it made me look at my own trauma
mhm,
and think
mhm,
about, like, how am I healing and how can I heal, and
mhm,
really
mhm,
understanding that trauma is deep into your brain, and it's sometimes living below consciousness.
mhm, mhm.
And yeah, there you go. It's like,
Yeah,
let's explain this model and
that's right.
everything that comes into the brain. And it shows you how it's just so simple to understand the brain. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist. You don't need to be a a neuroscientist. You could look at this model and understand it pretty easily
Mhm,
and
mhm.
quickly.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
absolutely.
amazing.
I don't know how many
Sure.
times I saw this diagram this past few days over at the
And
conference.
everybody walking around going like this.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
shutdown, cortical
Yeah.
shutdown.
Yeah, and of course, the book you
Yeah, that's a
mentioned,
great
"What
book.
Happened to You." Yeah, absolutely. I think this was absolutely a fantastic book. I actually got this one on Audible and spent a lot of time listening to it, and it was a fantastic listen as well. So I want to go ahead and wrap us up. We're about at 5 o'clock. I do want to plug one other really important book here, and I know I mentioned this a couple times, but your book on building a trauma-informed restorative school, which is absolutely fantastic. How can people get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about your work, or where can they find you?
Easiest way is just my website, which is
Okay.
joebrummer.com.
Okay. And I'm
Um,
going to go ahead and put that in the chat as well, so people can grab that link.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
fantastic. So, um, Joe, I greatly appreciate. I know we had set this up even before the conference, but I greatly appreciate you taking time to, come and share your thoughts and ideas. And I've not only been seeing the comments here. I got an email a few minutes ago from somebody going, "Wow, this is really great." I think that your work is really influential, and really appreciate you taking time to join us today. And I appreciate all the audience that has been watching. I'm putting the
Yeah.
link to your website in here, but I'm so grateful for what you're doing. It is so empowering to go to that event we just went to, but even to do these kind of events and know that we're talking to fellow disruptors. Okay.
Yes.
Matthew Portell uses that a lot, that the idea of disruptors, people that are really trying to make a difference. And it's so great to be able to stand, shoulder to shoulder with you and Matthew and so many others that are doing this amazing work. So I want to give you a huge thanks for spending time with us today, for sharing your story and about all the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Thanks for supporting the book, and I'm super grateful for your support of my work. I really appreciate it. And
Absolutely.
some of these people in the comments who I see, like one of my schools is there, Hamden Middle School. I'll give them a shout out. My awesome sisters out there, Beth Tolley, who's been supporting me for a long time. A lot of folks I see commenting here are people who've been following me and supporting me a long time, and I can't tell them how grateful I am, because this work's hard. And sometimes if I didn't have people like pushing me to keep going. Sometimes I
Yeah.
get discouraged, I lose my confidence, and so that's the stuff that helps me keep going. So I super super appreciate that the people that are here that support me, and I thank them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I was just thinking back, I'm like, it was Matthew Portell who actually told me about your book before it had come out, and I think I pre-ordered it on Amazon, and of course, then I got busy and had lots of things
And of course,
to
he's on the
work on.
back of the book. He like gave it a plug.
Oh, yeah,
He's
yeah,
been
yeah,
awesome
yeah.
to me.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's great to see this kind of growing community of disruptors and people trying to bring about positive change. Let's move past 1950 science. Let's use what we've learned about the brain and about trauma and make a world a better place. I'm going to ask you to hang
Yeah,
around for 30 seconds if you would, because I have a quick question for you on the other side of this. But
yeah,
let me just
absolutely.
announce to the audience here, I want to thank you for joining us. Did want to mention our next event. So we've got another event in 2 weeks, as always. This one's really interesting. We're talking about the dehumanization and restraint in ABA-based feeding therapies. So this gets into specific therapies really designed to help individuals that can, in fact, be harmful. And Carolyn Braun's going to be presenting that. She's an autistic speech-language pathologist, and really looking forward to hearing about her work and what she's going to be doing. So shifting gears a little bit next time. But as always, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. All right. Thank you.